Hi guys, I wanted to finish up my talk from OpenVis Conf. I didn't get as much time to spend on Ember as I would have liked, so I'm just going to wrap up the demo and make sure I cover everything. So here is the same page that I was showing during the talk. Right now it's a blank screen and the code is right here. All I have here are the dependencies for Ember and some CSS. And just this navigation up here, and everything else is blank. So we're starting off with a clean slate. And so, as I mentioned, the route object in Ember is what's responsible for getting the data from your server or from wherever to the client side of your application. And so when we're building an Ember app, this is usually where we start our thinking. We say where we're going to get the data from, and the answer that Ember gives us is the route. But first we have to create a router, and the router, what we see here, we write ember.application.create to kick off the whole thing. And then we create this router, and this is kind of like creating a list of routes, similar to how you would do it in other frameworks. Here we're creating resources, and this you can think of as representing the resources that your backend API will expose. And so the small app that we're making is going to have a list of our companies, and then it's going to have a pane down here that will show details about the selected company in sort of a master detail UI. And so we want to create two resources. The first is the companies, which is kind of like a backbone collection. It's our list of companies. It represents an array of company objects. And here we specify we want its path to be the root path of our application, so the index route, essentially. When the user visits the index, this is the resource that they're going to see represented. And then within this, we pass in, for the third parameter, this anonymous function, and that lets us specify a nested resource. So here we're telling Ember that we want to also have a company resource, but this company resource isn't standing on its own. It actually belongs to the parent of the company's resource. And this matters for your UI. In Ember, if you intend to make nested UIs, you want to nest your URLs. That way the resources map appropriately, and the parents will be available to the children, just like you would expect if you were doing a nested UI. Sometimes you need to reach up to the parent and get information about it, and so that's why we do this. In this path, we have a dynamic segment, similar to how you would see in Ruby on Rails, where we can specify the dynamic portion of the URL. And so here we're just saying we're going to pass in the ID, and the route object will take care of taking this ID and fetching the appropriate data. Now, how it actually does that, we specify with the route object itself. So first, we'll look at our company's resource. We'll make that part of our UI first. And so to do that, we create the company's route. And here we just extend ember.route. Now note that these names are important. We're not just choosing these randomly. We are using Ember's conventions. And this is partly how Ember wires everything together. So it's important that we learn the conventions. When we create a resource, we get a route, we get a controller, we get a view, we get a template. And they're all named based on the resource. And of course this stuff is all customizable, but we'll just go with what works out of the box here because it's the easiest. So we create a company's route, and this is just because we're extending this doesn't mean we lose all the normal functionality. We get everything that the normal route would do, except here we're defining the model hook, and this is how we tell Ember specifically how to get the data. Now, normally here you could have some separate model layer in that would take care of this, or you could actually add an AJAX call right here, but here we're just going to be returning the same simple data that we were throughout the other demos. And so now we've told Ember that when the user visits the company's route, this is the data that should be presented to them in some form. But to actually display it, we want to create a view. And the view is going to be, like I said, the company's view. And that company's view is a similar object to a directive or a backbone view in that it's responsible for rendering a portion of the GUI. And it usually has a template, although it doesn't have to, just like our backbone view and Angular directive for the D3 portions didn't have to have a template, but they could also have a template. And so first here, we're just looking at Ember Basics without D3, and we're just going to use a template. Now, if we just are going to use a template, we actually don't need to create the view object itself and then specify its template in a property. The default is for Ember to create that view object for us, and we just specify the name of the template right here. And so just like we could have defined templates inline in Backbone, we could just use this script tag to do that for us. And if we tell it an ID of companies, then Ember is going to know this is the template we need to render for the company's route using the models we've returned from the model hook. And so the template is simple. It's just an unordered list, and each handlebars helper will go over each of the models that we've returned. We've returned an array of models, so this is going to iterate over each one of them, and we'll just render the name property on our objects, which is right here. So that should be all we need, and there we go. We see Ember's booted up. We're visiting the index route here because we're just on this initial route, and we see the list of names of the companies. So that was pretty simple. Now we want to actually show our company in addition to the companies. So right now we should be able to visit /1, for example, but nothing's showing because we don't have, we haven't told Ember how to actually get that data. So we do the same process. We create the route, just like we did with the company's route. We specify the model. In this case, because it's nested, we can just get the parent models. This is reference to the parent array, and we just want to find the one that matches the ID that's being passed in from the parameters. And so now we have the appropriate model that we need for this route. And then similarly to before, we need to create a template for it to actually display it in the GUI. And so that's what this is here. And again, we specify that this is the right template just by using this ID. And here we don't have to iterate over anything because the model that this template represents is just a single company, because the resource that this route belongs to, that it points to, is a single company. And Ember knows that it's a single company rather than an array because here we're returning a single object. In the company's route, we return an array, and so Ember knows that difference for us. So here we can just use name, and that's going to point directly to that model object that we hand this template. And then we're going to say last year we made such and such revenue and this much cost. Okay, so if we save this and refresh, notice there's still nothing showing up, and if we go to 2, there's nothing showing up. But we're not getting that error anymore, so it seems like things are working. So why can't we see anything? Well, we actually need to tell the parent template where to render the child template, and we just do that with this simple handlebars helper outlet. And so because this is master detail, because our resources are nested, when we visit this route, this parent route will actually also be nested. So if you think of iTunes, when you click on an album and you see the list of the tracks, you're still seeing all the albums. And so that's the idea here. And so that's why we need to tell the parent resource where to put the child resources template. And so once we have this outlet, then Ember is going to take this template and render it into that outlet. And so here we refresh and we see this is in fact this detail div, and it's filled it in with the template for the child model. And so if we switch here to a different ID, ID 1, or ID 3, or ID 0, or 4 rather, then we can get back and forth. And we can use the back buttons and everything switches. correctly, and we can refresh on an ID and everything renders correctly, right? So this is kind of the Ember router at work. The Ember router is really crucial to Ember keeping everything in sync. And we can see here, if we just make these route objects separately and return things, then everything's going to stay in sync for us. Now, one thing that's nice to do is to use controllers to decorate our models. Here we're displaying raw values from our models, and you can imagine these names, the revenue and the cost, coming directly from our database on our server side. But often in creating GUI applications like this, you want to massage the data and transform it and maybe format it in a certain way. In general, you want to perform transformations on it to get it suitable for presentation in the actual final GUI itself. And so the controllers in Ember provide you with a really nice way to do this in a way that's cleanly separate from the models themselves. And so because we have created this company resource, we've also gotten this company controller. Now Ember has been making this company controller for us. We just haven't needed to change its default behavior. And so here we can redefine it, and this is how we can add transformation methods. And so here we add a profit method. And in this method, this is actually pointing to the controller, but the controller acts as a proxy for the model. And so if there isn't a property on the controller, it will go back and point directly to the model. So we can just treat this as if we were working on the model itself, but it provides us this clean separation between these transformations that are purely for the GUI layer. They have nothing to do with syncing data back to the server. We just want to show the profit, and we're going to calculate it based on the revenue and the cost, but we don't need to save the profit back to the server. And so that's kind of one of the main things that controllers are used for. And so we just make a normal function, and we return the revenue minus the cost, which is the profit. And then we do this funny thing. At the end of this function, we have .property, and then we pass in revenue and cost as strings. Now what this does is it tells Ember that this function is not really just a function, it's actually a computed property. And there's lots to read up on computed properties, but the general idea is that other languages actually have properties. There's a lot of static languages that have properties, but the idea is that you can use this throughout your application, both in the template layer and in other functions that you need, other methods that you create, as if it were a property. And so this is almost like, now we can treat it as if we had profit as a field in our database. And that greatly reduces kind of the cognitive load that it takes to think about all these different moving parts in your application, when you can just treat them as if they're calculated values. And Ember will also cache these for you until it needs to recalculate them. And the way it knows when it needs to recalculate them is by looking at these strings that you pass into this property method. And so this is kind of a very declarative way of specifying what this computed property depends on. And so what we're saying here is, if the revenue changes on this model, or if the cost changes on this model, then go ahead and recalculate profit. But if anything else changes on the model or any other part of the application, you can just use the cached result of profit. And that way, anytime we call profit, or we pass profit into another function, or we render profit in the template, it's actually just going to use that cached value. It's not going to recalculate, it's not going to invoke this method each time. And so this is a really great way to separate out our data transformations. And so once we have this, we can actually just throw this into our template. And so this was our detailed template, and now we're just adding what the profit was. And see, we're putting it here just as if it were a profit property on the model, but it shows us right here, and it's being calculated. And if we were to change these anyway, then that would change as well, and it gets recalculated when we change models. Or we refresh, everything stays in sync. So the next step, we usually don't like forcing users to type in the URL of every page they want to see. We want to give them links. And so to give them links, we're just going to change this company's template to, instead of just displaying the names, we're going to display links. And the way we do that, basically all we change is, instead of just printing the name, we use this helper that comes with Ember. It's a link to helper. The first parameter is what is going to be displayed as the label of the link. So we want to display the name just like we were before. It's just going to be in between anchor tags. And the anchor tags are going to link to this route, which is the company route. That's what we want each anchor tag to link to. And then this last parameter is what we pass to that route. And what it represents is the model that that route needs to render. And so this way, the template itself will tell Ember which model it needs to render. So let's try it out. And so we see this is already highlighted because we're on 2, and now we can click around and everything's working. And it still works if we refresh because Ember knows to get the model from the route definition. And so that's pretty much all it takes. We now have an application that, this could be much more complex detail pane, but the point is we have links and navigation to these models. We have a nice way to decorate them, and Ember's keeping our URLs and all the pieces of our GUI in sync. It's managing instantiation of all the objects that it takes, all the views that it takes to get this up. It will tear down views if we leave this route, and we don't need this portion anymore, so Ember's taking care of all that for us. Okay, and so the last thing we want to do before moving on to the D3 component portion is to make a component. And similar to what we did with Angular, even though this is not super complicated and in a normal application, it would be fine to leave this in the main company's template, we're going to extract this into an Ember component just to demonstrate how they work, because that's what we're going to be using to encapsulate our D3 charts. So the first step to making a component, if we're using only a template, we can actually just write the template for the component. But let's go ahead and make an instance of it just to show you what it looks like. And we just extend the component just like we're doing with all the other primitives that Ember gives us. And we'll call it the company detail component. The second step is to make the actual template for the component. And we do that the same way we've made all these templates. Now, of course, as your application gets bigger, you'll want to pull these templates into their own separate files. But this is just an easy way to do it for smaller apps or demos. The way we specify templates, a component's template is using this format for the ID. It's just component / the name of the component. And then here we're doing something very similar to the detail pane up here. Name, last year we made this, and then we'll add the profit back in. Now we're saying with company here, because similar to our directive from Angular, this component actually has its own scope. So when we come up here and we change this, we're going to delete this part and render instead our company detail component. But instead of just being able to reference name and revenue and profit, which belong to the company scope right here, we need to pass in the company. And that creates an instance variable for the component itself. So the component has its own scope. It's isolated from its context. And the reason we do this is the same reason we want to make our directive in Angular have an isolate scope. And that's to keep it more isolated from its surroundings, to encapsulate it more, and to make users of the component have to explicitly pass in the data that the component needs to work. It's just better encapsulation, and it's better reusability. And so the way we do that is just by passing it into the attribute. This left-hand side says the company variable in the component will have the value of this, and this in this context refers to the company itself. So we're just passing the company in essentially. And so here we can say with company, otherwise we would say company.name, company.revenue, right? With is just a shorthand, so we can just refer to the property names themselves. So this is the same as above. I'll just delete this because we've updated the company template. And if we refresh, we see everything's still working. But now this is using the component. And so obviously for this example, it's a little, it's not really necessary to do this, but it's more to show you how we can encapsulate this. And now we have, you can imagine if this was a much larger template with more complexity going on, it would be nice to have this little encapsulated portion. And we also have this object now to add our own custom behavior. So it's just a nice way to encapsulate things. So that's the basics of Ember. Let's move on to the D3 part. Here we're starting off with the exact same application, and we want to add D3 to it. So all we have is the same application, but we've referenced our BubbleChart from Angular's demo, and then of course the D3 library. So our first step is to create the BubbleChart component, and that's just a component that will wrap our BubbleChart. So we just create it, and we can add a class name to the element that will be rendered, the parent element of the component that will be rendered, the containing element essentially to the DOM, and that will let us style it. And this means we just don't have to actually go up and create a template just to add a class. So it's kind of a convenience method. And then we'll create an instance of our chart the same way we've been doing. And now this is a method that we've added to our chart in case there are no companies that are showing. And so it's just another piece of the API that we've extended our chart to have. And so we can set these kind of static properties here. This is a good place to set those. So we've created it. Now, to actually draw it, we need to create a draw function. I'm just calling this draw. It could be called whatever you want. But this uses the same API as we've been using. We select the element with D3, and this .get element is how we get to the kind of root element of this component. And then we pass in the data. This .get data. These are all get. This .get is just getting elements on the current object, and so these are all properties on the current object, the BubbleChart component object itself. Element is something given by Ember for us, but data and chart are our own properties. Chart we defined up here, but data we haven't defined anywhere. You don't see data anywhere in this whole class definition. So where does it come from? Well, it comes from the template. Just like in Angular, we pass in the data in the template layer, and similar to Angular, doing this enables us to set up our bindings between our data and our template right here in the template layer. So we don't have to write the actual code that subscribes to changes on the model. Now, we don't have a chart data property floating around. We have to create that. And so the place we create that is the same place we created the profit method. And that's on our controller. Remember, controllers are one of their roles is give you a place to manipulate the raw data into a form that's suitable for whatever you need on the GUI, whether that's some UI component or a D3 chart. And so before we had the company controller where we defined the profit, now we're going to make a companies controller, which represents the array. And that's because in this app, we're going to display our chart within the companies part, the list part, and not the detail part, because we want the chart to represent the list of companies. So it's going to go right here. And so we redefine the companies controller, and then we just define this chart data computed property. And this is doing the same thing that we did in the other apps. It's just returning the name and the revenue. It's returning the data in the form that our chart needs it to be in to consume. And then here we're specifying the dependencies of this computed property, and it's the content. Content is something Ember gives us, and that's what the controller is pointing to. It's the the data, the models, which we return from the route, which the controller is wrapping. And so if those change, we want our chart to update. And so that's it. That's all it took. We defined our method, which gave us the data. We passed the data into our template right up here. That gave us a local variable data on our bubble chart. And so in our bubble chart, we could pass that data in and then call our chart. So this is the same API as we've been using in all the other frameworks. And then down here, we use .observes, which is similar to .property, except that since draw, we're not really treating draw as a function that returns a value, right? It's just doing something. It's a function that doesn't return a value. And so we just want it to observe data and recalculate itself. It's not caching anything really. And then so we just want it to recalculate whenever its data changes. So this is whenever its data changes, which, if you remember, is whatever we pass into here. And so this is kind of how chaining computed properties and observers works. We know that whatever data we pass into our bubble chart will be rendered the same way, just like this. And we know that we want our bubble chart to re-render every time that data changes. We don't care how that data changes. We don't care who changes that data. Whatever we pass in here, if it changes, Ember is going to know that to tell our bubble chart that the data has changed and to redraw itself. And we already know that the chart data method, which we've defined here, will change if the content changes. But you can imagine adding other controls that will also change this chart data, say a filter, or looking at a subset, or resorting the data, right? And so the nice thing is once you do that, you just add those functions, add those dependencies, and everything else kind of just works. And so that's how computed properties can really help you out with building these kinds of visualizations that have multiple controls on them. So this is working well. We see the chart here that represent the companies, and as we scrub through, everything is working, but this chart isn't really dynamic. It's not really doing much for us. It's showing us the values of the revenue, but that's about it. So let's add some more functionality. First, we want to have a select box. We want to have a box that can let us toggle between revenue and cost. And so we do that using this ember.select helper that comes with Ember. EM is just a shortcut for Ember. You can use M in any place you use Ember throughout the framework. To use this, you pass in an array of items, and then you create this property and bind it to value, which tells you which value is selected. This is being rendered in the company's template, and so we go to the company's controller to create these items. So down here, we just create these items property. So I'll move this up here. And again, we're creating this on the controller because this is just GUI level data. It's not going to be saved back to our database. And so we have this nice place to keep it separate from our actual model. Now these are available to the template. That's what controllers do. In addition to giving you a place to add transformation methods to your model data, they then pass that data off to the template. And so we just need revenue and cost. We create this property, and now our select box can bind to that data. And so here it is, revenue and cost. But we're changing it and we're not updating anything. We have a selected item property that will now stay bound to whatever is selected in this dropdown, but we want to pass it in. So we just want to pass selected item equals selected item. This value on the right is actually the value here. The value on the left is another local value, another local variable created within our components, our bubble chart component scope. So we come down to our bubble chart, and actually we don't need to send that in, and that's because that changes the data, but our bubble chart will automatically recalculate based on the data. So we just need to look at the data function, the chart data function. And here, instead of passing in revenue, we'll pass in whatever's selected. And now we'll also tell Ember that this depends not only on the content, not only on the models that we've returned from the route, but also whatever's been selected. And so now when the selected item changes, the chart data function computed property should be recalculated. Ember will notify our bubble chart that the data has changed, and the bubble chart should update itself. And it works. So all we had to do was create the select, the list box, and then use that selected item within our chart data function. That was all we had to change. We didn't have to change our bubble chart component at all. Again, it's really nice to be able to add these things that affect your charts and various pieces of your application and only really have to change the one thing. You're sharing certain properties across your objects, and Ember takes care of notifying them all when they need to change. Okay, next step. What we want to do is, this is nice and we're getting closer to what we want, but this we're using to navigate, and this is showing us some information, but imagine having even more companies. And why are we even showing this to begin with? Well, it's because it kind of shows us what's interesting, what piece of information within our data is interesting. So maybe we want to look at Acme Corp because it looks like they have the most revenue. Or we switch to cost and it looks like Dunder Mifflin has a higher cost than we thought. So we're interested. So we'd like to be able to actually click this and transition our app to the Dunder Mifflin detail, just as if we had clicked the link. And of course we want everything to stay in sync. So how do we do that? How do we make our component communicate with the rest of our application? Well, we do it with actions. Once our component renders, which is on the did insert element hook, we send an action to the rest of our application. And we do that, we can use D3 here to just select all the nodes, and then whenever the user clicks them, we just want to send an action. And action is the name here of the primary action. You could also specify another name for secondary actions, but we just use this term action for the primary action. And then the data we're passing along is the index of the company we've clicked. So now if we just do this, we refresh and we click on a node, nothing happens. And that's because it's not sending an action because we haven't defined what it is. And just like we define our bindings in the template layer, we also defined our actions in the template layer. So here, not only do we pass in the chart data, but we specify that this action is select company. So the reason we do it like this is because this gives, if you imagine components being reusable, you want the user of your component to be able to specify the name of the action in terms of the domain of their own problem. So our problem here is we're displaying a list of companies and we want our users to be able to see details about that companies. So what does it represent? What does it mean when a user clicks a bubble? Well, they're selecting a company. So we want that to be select company. In another context, we might want it to be select a state, right? Or select some other thing. And so this allows us that level of abstraction. If we just save this and reload it, and we click on this, we actually get an error. And the error says, nothing handled the action select company. And that's because actions in Ember have to be handled. They're not like events. Like there's click events and mouse over events going on all the time and nothing's handling them, and it doesn't matter. But in Ember, when you specify an action, you have to handle it. And so where do we handle it? Well, you can actually handle it in multiple places. The first place you can handle it is in the controller, which is rendering this view. And remember, this graph is in the company's controller, so we could add this action to the company's controller and write the event handler. But if you don't do that, it will bubble up to the route. And so we're going to actually go ahead and let it bubble up to the company's route and handle it there. And the reason is that we want clicking on this to transition us to a different route. And so that seems like it's more the responsibility of a route object than a controller object. So the way you do that is in this actions hash, you just create a new method with the name of the action we specified in the template. Remember, we've passed in the select company name, and so now we create this method, and it's going to invoke this method. The parameter is the index of the bubble we clicked. We sent that along with the action from our component. And then what do we want to do? We want to transition our app to the company route. And the model we want for that is the ith model in the company's controller's arrays of models. And so we just look for the ith element, and it's just like in the link to helper, we pass the correct model here. We're passing the correct model based on ith. Of course, you can use an ID when things get more complicated, but this is just one simple way to do it. And so now we can click on our bubbles, and we see it transitions our app. And it's keeping our links in sync. The URLs are in sync. We refresh, everything's okay. But there's one more problem, is that we're not actually getting visual feedback that this is working. It's working because we see this changing, but it would be really nice if our chart told us it was changing as well. And so this is kind of going back to the main thesis of this talk. We need to enhance our chart, and we want to enhance it in a way that it allows us to see the state of what has been selected. So we want maybe to add an active class to the node that's been clicked. But we want to do that in a way that is separate from the domain of our app. We don't want our bubble chart to know about a selected company, for instance. So we want to add a generic method to it that lets us select one of the bubbles, and that lets the user of our bubble chart know that the node that we've clicked will have an active class on it. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to switch over from our bubble chart 2, which we've been using, to the third bubble chart. And this is the enhancement right here. This is the only thing we've changed. We've added a select item method. And this is something, right, that the user of our chart can call, because this is a public method that we're exposing. And when the user calls this, passing in an index, then D3 will add the active class to that ith element and remove the active class from any other element. So that's what this function is doing right here. And so let's swap that in. And we see, first of all, it's working. It's just as before, we just don't have the new feature. What do we need? We need to pass to our component, which is isolated from the rest of the app, essentially, besides everything we pass it in. We need to tell our component, pass it in something that represents what is selected. And that's because right now all we've passed in is the data to render it. But we also need to pass in something that's in sync with the rest of our app. Right? The link to helper is staying in sync because Ember is essentially doing that for us. The link to helper is something that it gives us, and it already takes care of this. But when we start building our custom components and D3 components, especially, we need to think about how to bind them to our app, exactly what data they need to be in sync with everything that they need to be in sync with. And so that's kind of the mental thought process you go through in building these things. So we need to pass in a variable that represents what the selected company is so that our component can respond to it. And so to do that, again, this is being rendered in the company's controller. And so let's just create a selected company index property that we can pass in. Now, this is going to return the index of the current model. And the way it's getting the current model is it's actually going into the company controller. So all controllers have a property called controllers, which is an array of the controllers they have access to. And then we're getting the model, and we're actually just getting the index of that model from the current array. Now, once you start reaching across controllers, right? So we're reaching from the company's controller, which represents this portion. By the way, there's a Chrome inspector, an Ember tool here that is super useful in building Ember applications. And it actually shows your view hierarchy right here. So we can see when hovering over this, that is a company's controller is basically the parent route, parent controller, and then the parent template, and that's basically our whole application, and that the company route and company controller and company template is nested inside, right? So back to this point, once you start reaching across controllers, so we're reaching from our company's controller to our company controller, we need to specify that in needs here. And so needs will give us this property here. And so now we're essentially making this computed property, which will update every time the selected model changes, which is whenever we change the URL. But now we can pass this selected company index to whatever needs it. So this will be 1, 2, 3, or 4. It's essentially going to be the dynamic portion of the URL here. But we can pass it into any object that needs it. And so let's pass it in. So we'll write our bubble chart like this. And so we're passing in the selected bubble needs to be the selected company index, right? And so now in our bubble chart, we're just going to add a new function that does this for us. It says we are observing the selected bubble. Every time the selected bubble changes, we actually want to get our chart index and then call select item. And this was the method that we added on our bubble chart. So now we know this essentially is going to call the method on our chart and add the active class to the right node. And it's using the selected bubble property. So it's passing in that selected bubble property. And this will automatically be invoked every time selected bubble changes. So just to go over that again, we created a selected selected company index property on our controller, which represents this, came from this portion. We pass it into our component. Now our component has a property called selected bubble, which is bound to the selected company index. So selected bubble is 1, 2, 3, or 4. So it's 1 right now, 2 right now, 3 right now, 4 right now. So our component knows what the dynamic portion of the URL is. And then we just want to invoke that select item index on our method on our bubble chart every time it changes. And so we added this method down here that says every time it's selected, changes, then reinvoke that method. And so you might ask, like, well, why can't our component just ask the URL what the dynamic portion is? Wouldn't that be easier? Well, it might be easier, but the point is that that's something of an anti-pattern, because the URL exists to enable our application to basically deserialize the URL and get the data from our server, right? That's kind of the purpose of it. And the way Ember uses the URL is to match up the data our app needs with the different views that it creates. And so even though a lot of this seems a bit indirect, in the end, we now have this component that can be updated anytime this selected bubble property changes. And so if we had written it directly tied to the URL, it wouldn't have been reusable, because maybe we want to reuse it somewhere else where we want the selected bubble to change that has nothing to do with the URL. And so that's why we write it like this. And finally, when we first, every time we draw, we want to update, right? So every time the data changes, we want to make sure to update, and we also want to change it if the data doesn't change but if the selected bubble changes. And finally, there's one little thing we need to do. This is kind of just a little hack. When we go off a company route, so if we go, let's say, from the home to 1 and then back to the home, the model will actually still exist on the company controller. And so the selected company index will actually still be the same. We want to clear that out. So every time we leave the company route and go back to the initial route, the company's route, so on deactivate, we want to just set that content to null. It's because controllers in Ember are persistent, and that's a good thing because they don't have to be torn down. They just are, basically their views are destroyed from the screen, but the data is held in memory all on that controller. So if you go back to that route, all that data is ready to go. But in our case, we're proxying that model. And so we want to set that content to null so that the changes percolate throughout our different components. So now if we refresh and we click, now we see the node has the active class, and we've made that orange in our CSS. All the styling in this whole app is just CSS. But this node has the active class. And we click off of it, and this one, and so everything is now synced up. And now our users can actually use the bubble chart to guide them through the app. And if we use the back and forward buttons, everything stays together. And if we go back to the index route, it deselects. And that was the deactivate route I talked about. Right? And then we can also change the cost and say, okay, well, now this is interesting. Let's go here. So this is definitely more learning curve here to learn all these things. And the reason is because, you know, Ember tries to give you objects that have roles for all these different pieces. But notice we've been able to put all of these parts of this application, which is fairly simple, but it has a lot to it. It has routing, it has different modular parts that are in sync, and it works if you refresh the page and everything stays in sync. And it's very extensible because all of our methods are very short, and we can add other pieces to it. And in general, the way these things expand is you add all other controls and stuff, and they all affect each other. And the only way you have to really manage those dependencies between the parts is by extracting them to a common property in your controller and then passing them around in your templates. And so this turns out to be a pretty good pattern for building these types of applications. And so just to wrap up really quick, just to make it clear that our bubble chart still doesn't know about, it doesn't know anything about Ember. It's still just D3. It doesn't know anything about companies. We added a feature to it, which was the fact that now it has some sense of its state. It has the ability for the user to call a select item method. But we enhanced it outside the boundaries of the framework, and now we could use that feature in an Angular app, in a Backbone app, in an app that uses no framework. And so this is really the pattern that we're talking about here. Components in Ember, like directives in Angular, are completely shareable because they have an isolate scope. And so you can make a directive that doesn't have that, but the kind of directives we talked about are similar to components in that way. The model layer in Ember is actually a separate library, which is younger than Ember framework itself, but it's very far along. And if you're using something like Ember Data, which is the main model layer that people use when building Ember applications, then you can do all the things that we've talked about. You would just get your model data, and actually in this case you probably wouldn't do anything different. And it just in the route objects themselves, how you fetch the data would be slightly different. But once you get it into your system, all the transformation methods that we did in the controllers would be the same. And hopefully you saw just a glimpse of the power of computed properties. But I find that instead of having to write watch and then write your callback function using the parameter passed in, just declaring your dependencies using that .property syntax is a very easy way to just expand the complexity of all the dependencies with your app, and you just don't have to think about it that much, and Ember takes care of calculating those lazily, caching them when it doesn't need to recalculate them, and so that turns out to be really nice when doing these kinds of apps. And so really quick, just to wrap up, all of this is really talking about reusability. We want to enhance the chart in isolation from the framework, and we want to iterate between building our app, understanding how the framework's idioms apply to our app, and open up new possibilities for our charts. Just like here, Ember a lot of it is based on routing and creating applications that don't break the URL, and we want our D3 chart to be able to do the same thing and take advantage of that. We define transformations in our examples mostly on controllers. Now there is another pattern where you could argue that our Ember component should know how to render an array of Ember models, and so you could pass in the array of models and define the transform on the component itself. That's another pattern, but I tend to like to do it on the controller. Which framework is best for D3? Well, this is kind of not the right question. The right question is which framework is best for the application you're building. And even if you want to use a framework, I'm a big fan of using a framework. Not everyone is, but as we've seen, we can incorporate D3 into any one of the frameworks we've looked at, which are all very different. And so using this pattern, you can incorporate D3 into any framework or any non-framework. So yeah, I don't think one of the frameworks is best. It's more a question of which framework is best for the application you're building, that you're most comfortable with, that your team is most productive with, etc. And finally, because a lot of this is about building reusable charts, I encourage you to check out d3.chart, the library from Boku, because that's a library that's specifically built to help you build reusable charts and create an API that's extensible and reusable, and that makes it very nice to hook into your different applications across different frameworks, but still achieve a high level of customization and expressivity. So I would encourage you to check that out, or just look up some basic patterns in JavaScript OOP. So that's the end, and if you want to check out this code, you just look at this repo on GitHub. Thanks a lot for listening.